Okay, this is going to be a little tutorial to show you how to create the mash for any kind of whiskey. Um, I'm just going to be doing a basic corn whiskey, but it won't be 100% corn. It'll be partially corn, wheat, and rye. It'll be mostly corn because I'm low on the wheat and rye. But all I use is an 8-gallon brew pot. Uh, Stock pot would work just fine. The only reason I went this route is because it already had the drain spout in the bottom and a built-in thermometer. This one, the drain spout, uses has a little filter that threads in there. See if I can keep that in focus. Maybe, maybe not. So on the inside, that filter connects to that. And then this is pretty much like a jar rack that you would put in a stock pot if you're, I don't know, canning fruits or who knows what. I'm not an expert on that stuff. But this will create about a 4-inch gap on the bottom. Now, even though that is perforated, I still do everything in a brew bag. A brew bag looks identical to a paint strainer bag that you would use to, put in a 5-gallon bucket to strain paint through to take clumps out of it. So basically what I do, I put 6 gallons of water in here, and then I use 8 pounds of materials for the mash. So in this case, that's 2 pounds, that's 1 pound, that's 3. I will have to come up with another 2 pounds of corn, and all I'm going to use is cracked corn that you would get from Baumgars. Even though it's mostly cracked, I still blast it through a food processor to break it up a little more, because you want to get all of the starch out of whatever you're boiling, because that starch is what gets converted to sugar, and then yeast eats the sugar and turns it into alcohol. So I thought I'd give a quick rundown of this. You can see it's graduated there, so you can tell how much water is in it. But a person doesn't need to use a brew pot. Like I said, you could use a stock pot. Most people do. They just modify them and put a spout in the bottom and use a jar rack. And as for the thermometer in there, that's really not necessary. You could just use one of these kind of meat thermometers for a roast. Those work just fine. You're not dealing with real high temperatures here. You bring it up to about 180 to boil all your starch out of your mash materials, and you'll know when all the starch is out, because it will thicken up in there like paste. You will hardly be able to get a spoon through it. And then you let it cool down to about 150 degrees, and you could use malted barley, or you can just buy amylase enzyme. And that's what I do. I mean, yeah, the true way to do it is to use malted barley, because that's its primary thing that it releases is amylase enzyme, but it also releases starch as well, so it'll bump up your sugar count even more. I just like to keep it as stupid simple as possible. So that's that for this part. I'll be back in a few seconds when I start making up the mash. Okay, I'm back. As you can see, I got about 5.5 gallons of water in there. I'm just leaving a little bit of headspace because I don't know how much room all of the mash ingredients are going to raise that. What I was referring to earlier about a brew bag, that's all it is. Some people like to say that's cheesecloth, but no, it's actually some type of a vinyl or polyester. It has a drawstring on the top, so once that gets up to about 180 degrees, we're slowly getting there. I'll drop the brew bag in there and add the ingredients for the mash. Now, what I was saying about using cracked corn, that's basically all it is. Chicken feed. You can make whiskey for chicken feed. It's pretty well ground up, but if you have some large kernels in there, the water's not going to be able to get into it and release the starch. So it's always best to blast that through a food processor or a blender to help powderize it. Not really powderize it, but break it up a little more. There's another thing that people do. They actually use sweet feed to make whiskey. Sweet feed has got all kinds of grains in it that you would normally find in whiskey. It also has corn in there, but it also has molasses, which is what rum is made out of. So if you make a sweet feed mash, you'll get something that tastes like a cross between whiskey and rum. Very light on the rum side because there isn't a whole lot of molasses in there. But it's a common thing people do. I mean, they've been doing it for ages. Moonshiners down in the South, they would use anything that had starch in it that could be converted to fermentable sugars. So I just thought I'd show that. Where are we at here? Slightly below 160. So we'll let that get a little ways further, and I'll drop the brew bag in there and start boiling up the mash. Okay, we're back. We're further down the road here. Going to turn my heat down to about my second notch. It's at 180 degrees. Oops. Keep my finger out from in front of the lens. Get rid of that lid really quick. So the first thing we're going to add here is the cracked corn. I quickly ran that through food processor and it broke it up for the most part. But my measurements or my weights were a little off. I thought I had 3 pounds of this flaked corn here. No, it's actually 2.5. So this is a good example of why I left the headspace in the top of the brew pot. Because these are both 2.5 pounds. Look how much more space that takes up. It's because of all the air in between the kernels. So, good thing I left headspace on there. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to dump this in. Contrary to what some people might tell you, never try to use cornmeal. It's not like it won't work. It's just that cornmeal will create such a huge mess, and you'll have a bitch of a time straining it later. Because the way I like to do things is the way that they do it in an actual distillery. Some people like to make their mash and then convert it with the enzyme and then strain it off. You know, pull that bag out, let it hang for a while. Well, the problem is you never get all of the sugar out of it. You'll still have sugar trapped in that mash. So if you ever go to a distillery, you'll see that they actually ferment everything all together. They don't strain the mash off before they add the yeast. Let's see if I can grab this other bag and drive this one-handed. This could be a little complicated. Seeing that I'm just using a cell phone. Get all of this in here. So that's 5 pounds of corn. That'll be the first thing that we boil up to release the starch. This will take a little longer than the other items, so I'm going to do this first. Probably let this one steep for about an hour, and then I'll add the rye and the wheat. I always use flaked rye, flaked wheat, things like that, because it allows them to release faster. And yes, you can also use Quaker oats or Chestnut Hill oats, whatever, dollar store oats. Anything that has starch in it. That's the key, is starch gets converted to fermentable sugars, and it really doesn't matter what you use to get your starch from. You could use potatoes. Granted, that's what people think vodka is made out of, but most vodka is made out of corn or wheat these days. But yeah, anything that has starch, you can convert it to sugar and ferment it. And hell, there's people that even use bulk frosted flakes or regular corn flakes to make corn whiskey. Still works just fine. All of that starch is still there. So there's that part. As you can see, cracked corn does tend to have some other odd things in it, like pieces of stems and corn husks and things like that, but nothing to worry about. It all gets fermented anyway. So we're going to let this go for a while, and I'll add the other items later and see if there's anything else that I forgot to mention along the way. But I'm going to let this steep at 180 degrees for an hour, and that should be enough to get all of the starch out of the corn. Okay, back in a few. Okay, we're an hour into it, and most of the starch has come out of there. I forgot to mention that aside from having one of these big spoons like this, it's very helpful to have a long-handled whisk, because if you're using flaked corn, and especially if you do get brave and try to use cornmeal, you'll get these dough balls that you have to break up because the water just won't get through there and release all the starch that's holding that dry ball of cornmeal together. So that's a helpful thing to have around. But you'll see those little dark spots. Those are just bad kernels that were on the ears, but not a problem. I think I saw a dough ball there. I think I got most of them out, so I can safely add my wheat and rye. And even though I said this is 5 pounds of corn, and then there's 2 pounds, 2 pounds of wheat and 3 pounds of rye. Technically, I'm a little heavy on the corn, so this would qualify as bourbon because the Kentucky rules for bourbon say that it has to be at least 51% corn. And all those companies like Jim Beam and Wild Turkey, they have their own different recipes, but you can guarantee that what they produce is made with no less than 51% corn. So let's put the wheat in here. I'm sure that's going to make some healthy dough balls too. That flaked wheat has got a lot of free starch. Buddy. And after this cooks for a while, it actually smells like breakfast food, like breakfast grits. Especially if you use rolled oats. It tastes like, or smells like oatmeal cooking. So there's that. That was the wheat. Now we'll get the rye in here. Looks very similar to the flaked wheat. I always buy flaked everything. It just makes it easier to turn it into a mash. Now you see how thick that's getting? Buddy. And by the time this gets done cooking down for another half hour to an hour, this will be thick like porridge. I mean, just you'll hardly be able to get this spoon through it because it'll be so thick from all the starch. But that's not a problem, because at that point you reduce your temperature, let it get down to about 150. Since I was a little short on the water, I can add some cold water to this, or actually throw a tray of ice cubes in there to help cool it down. But you get it down to about 150, and you add the amylase enzyme, and that will thin it out again. It'll turn all of that starch into sugar. And I like to, if possible, if I can maintain the temperature, I will just let it sit and steep at about 150 all night long. And the next morning I'll turn the heat off and let it drop down. Oh, about 120 degrees is safe. Then you add yeast nutrient. I'll show you that later. And the yeast. There's different types of yeast that you can use. I like to squeeze as much alcohol out of it as possible to get myself a mash that ferments out about 16% ABV. And then you distill that. But I like to use both they call it Red Star Daddy. The DADY is Distiller's Active Dry Yeast. I like to use a tablespoon of that and 1 packet of champagne yeast, because champagne yeast tolerates extremely high alcohol levels and will just chew up every bit of sugar that's left in there. So here we are, another 5-minute segment. So I'm going to cut this off and I'll be back when I'm ready to add the enzyme to it. Okay, here we are again. We're back after cooking this down. As I mentioned, once that starch gets released, this stuff gets really thick. See? And you're probably wondering, how in the hell does that thick bunch of goop become whiskey? I mean, now here's another thing. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the traditional way is to use malted barley to provide the amylase enzyme to that. Now, the barley is also going to add starch, which is, going to thicken it up even more. Can you imagine how hard it will be to get the spoon through this after you've added another dry material full of starch? So that's why I use these. It's the same chemical and it's still naturally derived and all that, but it's a lot easier just to throw a few tablespoons of this in there instead of a couple pounds of a dry malted barley. And let me take a peek down here. I turned off the heat. We're getting, a little bit below 180. Oops. You have to keep in mind all of this mash is a big insulator, so that that thermometer down on the bottom is going to be reading a much higher temperature than up top, because the heat down there can't escape. So it looks like we're at 155 degrees right now. Yep, 155. What I said earlier about the 150 degree mark, that's an approximation. I don't know. I think this thermometer down here is calibrated. Yeah. As you can see where it says starch conversion in there, that's right between 150 and 160. So it's actually safe for me to add the amylase enzyme to this right now. Boy, good luck keeping that camera focused. Get it closer. That's it. That's the trick. This is a whole lot easier to do when you're not holding the camera in one hand. Yeah. Half-blind guy with serious parallax error trying to reach a spoon into a bag, looking at a screen as his guide. Now, a lot of this, it's not going to happen instantly. Some of it will happen instantly. But The main, the actual full conversion of this will take hours, which is why I said that I like to let this steep all night. Oops, here, we'll let that. But I'll start working this in, and you'll probably see it starting to thin out in very short order. So it's 155 degrees on top. Oh, yeah, look at that. See that? We instantly have water showing up, or liquid showing up. That's how fast it works. But to do the full conversion, you really need to let this stuff steep all night long, or at least, a decent number of hours. Yeah, see how much thinner that automatically got? Just that fast. But if you let it run, and like I said, I like to let it run all night. I'll set my temperature control down here on the stove to like the first notch, and I won't put a lid on it because the lid will raise the temperature, and if it gets too hot in there, then that enzyme it'll die off. But yeah, I'm already getting, see that liquid around the edge. It thinned out that, it thinned out that much that fast. But the longer it sits with that enzyme in there, and I'll probably add more. That was 3 tablespoons. There's 5 gallons. I should add at least 2 more tablespoons and then check it in an hour. If it's not thinning out like I want it to, maybe toss 2 or 3 more tablespoons in there. I know a lot of people will say that is entire overkill, but I mean, this stuff isn't that expensive. What, that little 1 pound bag right there, I think it's $15, something like that. It lasts a long time. And then before we put the yeast in there, we put this in. Granted, back in the old days, yeast would do pretty much a good job on its own without any help, but yeast could die off quickly, with the only nutrient left in there being dead yeast cells for the live yeast to feed on. Some people used to mash up raisins because of the chemicals that are in raisins, and that makes a great yeast nutrient. But here we have another case. This stuff's like $10 for a 1 pound bag. It'll last forever. Oh, there goes an angry beagle. But that's it for this part of this video. I'll come back again once this has dropped down to 150 degrees and thinned out even more. And then I will start a new video tomorrow showing how to pitch the yeast, start the fermentation, and show how the fermentation progresses just over the course of a few hours. It'll be violent. It's crazy. And even though this thing may have dropped to about 70 degrees, by that time, it'll be 70 degrees down here, but the more you move your hand up towards the top, that fermentation creates heat up here, and this will be about 80 or 90 degrees. So, one more segment, and I'm going to publish this video to YouTube in the morning. Moving on. Okay, I believe we are ready for the last segment / installment on this video that I'm going to upload. The mash has been sitting here. The stove is on its low setting. The temperature, if this damn thing will focus, right above 150 degrees. We're going to let this stay there all night. But notice the difference. It's much thinner now. It's all watery on top. That's because of that amylase enzyme converting all of that starch to sugar. Now it's kind of hard to tell the difference between starchy water and sugary water because they're both going to be extremely thick. But if I take a spoon of that out and see how it loosely falls out of the spoon now, that is an indication that the sugar is, or the starch is turning into sugar now. And if I let this stew all night long, simmer, steep, whatever, it'll be even thinner in the morning. But I'm doing pretty good right now. That's really good. As far as results, those are really good results. If you can take a scoop of that mash out, start tipping it, and it falls away loosely, that means the starch has gone away. It's turned into sugar. It'll never be perfectly thin because sugar water is, well, obviously thicker than clear water. But if a person is bored, you just pretty much sit here and stir this. And if you do find any dough balls, I'm not finding any now. I've taken care of them. But if you do find any, you just kind of dump it quickly over to the side and take your spoon and just go, smash it against the side. That'll break up your dough balls. And you want to get those dough balls broken up because the enzyme that's in here has to get to the starch within those little dough balls to convert them to sugar. But I think that's all there is for this video. I think I saw a corn dough ball go by. Maybe, maybe not. Tomorrow I will start working on a new video. Oh, there was a corn dough ball right there. Oh, where did he go? There he is. We'll get rid of you, little bastard. Doesn't really help to get super greedy about things. You're going to have dough balls that are going to slip through, but you get most of them and you're still going to be doing good. But tomorrow's video, I'll show you how to pitch the yeast and read the sugar level that's in there by default with the existing mash materials. And it's still a given that, in small production operations like this, you still have to add sugar to things to bring it up to. If you're talking about gravity points, it's 1.090, or if you're talking about Brix points, it's going to be 22. But you want to get it up as close to 22 as possible, because once you pitch the yeast at that level, you'll end up with a 16% ABV, maybe higher. Mash after it ferments out, and at that point after you distill it, you'll end up with a gallon of actual alcohol. I know it seems kind of strange. There's 5 gallons of stuff in here. Well, actually 6, 5.5, 6. But the actual alcohol content, if you're talking about 16%, or slightly above that, you're going to end up with about a gallon after 5.5, 6 gallons of material in your brew pot. I know it seems strange, it seems kind of wasteful, and you're thinking, oh my God, that's just a lot of work for a little bit of alcohol. But no, actually, you end up diluting that alcohol with distilled water, and you will end up with 4 quarts of premium whiskey. More on that later, but here we are at this point. Looks like we've got a good conversion going. We got a really good conversion going. So we'll move on to the next step on the next video. Later. This is Larry signing off.